Afternoon, so we want to get you on that airplane. We also want to have an opportunity to play as well. So get started on time. So we got a great beginning today, and I'm going to turn it over to Daniel Hamlin, who's going to introduce our speaker this morning.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you hear this mic? I don't know if it's resonating. Yeah, kind of. All right, let me, you know what, I'll try. I've got another mic. How's that? A little better. Okay. Well, I'm very excited to have an opportunity this morning to introduce Commissioner Manny Diaz of Florida. He's a lifelong educator. He began his career as a social studies teacher and a baseball coach in Miami-Dade public schools. He was also a public school assistant principal at one time. He's been a leader in higher education institutions, specifically in Doral College in Florida. In 2012, he was elected to the House of Representatives in Florida, and he became well known for his work on school choice and education reform during his time in office. And in 2018, Commissioner Diaz moved on to the Florida Senate and served there as chairman of the Education Committee. Notably, he sponsored the Family Empowerment Scholarship. That's an education savings account program in Florida. It's widely considered the most expansive ESA in the nation, and I believe today it serves around 83,000 students, maybe nearly 84,000, and it has 100% eligibility for the program. Last year, he was unanimously appointed Commissioner of Education in Florida, where during that time, he's now continued to work on issues related to school choice and reform in Florida. So would you please join me in welcoming Commissioner Manny Diaz.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I'd like to thank you and Paul Peterson for the invite. This is great to have here and to be able to come up here and speak with so many individuals involved in this movement and at a place where policy comes first and foremost. So just thank you for the invite. I appreciate it and the introduction. I also like to thank Governor DeSantis and our administration for their unwavering commitment to educational excellence and figuring out ways how to improve education. And in Florida, we've done it quite a few different ways. But you know, I'd like to start just focusing on a quote that is talked about a lot and it's used a lot and over again. But what does it really mean? And that's the quote from Martin Luther King, where he said that he had a dream that his 4 little children will be one day living in a nation where they'll not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And the question that I have is, you know, and these words have been in the minds of Americans across the decades, and every single parent in our nation has had those words in their head. But what does it really mean? What does it really mean? Not just in just everyday society, but when we talk about education, to be able to have that opportunity for a student to, regardless of what zip code they come from, regardless of what their background is, regardless of if they immigrated from another country and don't speak the language, or if they come from a single parent home, do they really have the same opportunity to be educated and become a productive citizen in this great country, right? So that's something that in Florida we've taken very seriously. And despite the fact that for decades education has really been controlled by educational elites, and at least they want to give you that narrative, right? Those folks that tell you that they know better just because, or that they know better than parents, and that parents just step aside, right, and not decide what is best for education of their children. That's a movement that is broken. That's a movement that is not serving the needs of our kids. That is a movement that has another agenda. And I think that agenda has to do with the adults, right? What is the agenda of an established teachers union? I know there was a famous quote, I think from Marvin Schenken at one point that said that they'll start representing the kids when the kids start paying dues. Well, the problem is that I don't even think they're representing the teachers at this point, because if you look at what their agenda is, it has nothing to do with improving education. It has nothing to do with improving salaries or working conditions. It has to do with maintaining a grip on that exclusive monopoly that has been our traditional, and I don't like using that word because it's not correct. It's our government schools that were started under the premise of making sure that we have an educated populace that is able to maintain our republic. It doesn't mean that we are in the business of employment. And that's the problem that has occurred over the decades, is that our schools are in the business of employment. I come from a state where in some of our rural counties, it's either the school system or the correctional institution that is the largest employer, right? And so when you start messing around with the status quo there, you get a quick response. And having spent 10 years in the legislature, it gives me a little bit of a different perspective. And I'm still so recent out of it that I still have relationships, right? So coming from Miami, the perspective is very different, where you have a very dense, very populated metropolitan area with a lot of schools and people with a different perspective. When you go into a rural county in Florida and you start messing around with the number of enrollments that may happen at a school, that is going to cause some trouble. And if you're a legislator that's elected in that area, that's where it creates issues. And I know that this has been a roadblock in other states. I mean, having conversations with colleagues in Texas over the years, you always think, I mean, even being from Florida, we always think like Texas is going to do all these things. Their roadblock is, think about it. I think they have 2,200 school districts. So multiply 2,200 school districts by whatever number of school board members they have that are elected. That becomes very powerful locally, especially if you're a state representative and you have a smaller district. The Senate has been more aggressive there, and then you figure out why, because Senate districts are bigger and smaller areas within the Senate districts have less effect on those members. And so that's been eye-opening. And so I really want to kind of go into the Florida story. And I'm very cognizant, and I try to be humble with it, because I know sometimes there may be people outside of Florida that are with education keep getting the Florida story like smashed over their head. And I can't help but brag and have the opportunity to share our success. But I don't do it in that manner. I do it in a manner because a lot of times what happens is both people in the school choice movement, legislators that want to reform, or others in other states want to know how we did it. And I'm going to tell you that even though the Florida story only goes back probably at this point 21, 22 years when it comes to education reform, starting with Governor Jeb Bush, there were periods of time where there was stagnation and no movement. And so I kind of got the ability to come in the middle of that and see it from the perspective of a freshman legislator who had an educational background coming into a legislature that had just implemented term limits. So there was a lack of institutional knowledge. And so how are we able to re-spark that? And how do you get around the issue of, no, we just did all of this. It's time for us to take a break and let all the dust settle. And all of you know, especially today, that are involved in this movement, that doesn't work. That is not the way to move this forward. That is not the way to provide the best educational options for each individual child. And so we have 1.6 million students participating in some form of school choice in Florida. That's more than the total enrollment of 35 states. We have about 2.9 or 3 million total public school students. So if you look at that, 1.6, that is a large amount, and that has implications across the board. And I'll tell you a little bit about what those implications are as we go through that. But one of the things that the other side that is against this movement will tell you is that if you pass this law, if you divert this money, if you take this money from, which doesn't belong to the schools, by the way, it's the taxpayers' dollars, you're going to doom the public schools. They're all going to close. This is the end of the world, right? The end of the republic. It's all those things. The sky is falling. Well, I got to tell you that it has not happened in Florida, despite all of the policies that I'm going to go over. In fact, Miami-Dade County, which is our largest county, it is the third largest public school district in the country, not only has 70% of its students attending a school of choice, meaning it is a school other than the one that they are zoned for. That includes charters, that includes magnets, that includes open enrollment, which is a policy that we passed in Florida about 5 years ago. That includes specialty academies, and it does include charters and other species of choice schools. But the district figured out that the movement in South Florida was coming so fast and was becoming so popular that the only way that they could survive was to improve their services, to improve their offerings. And I'll tell you, I sat in a public school as a teacher, as was mentioned, but what was really eye-opening to me was the time I spent as an administrator. And so I was 26 when I became an assistant principal, and I became an assistant principal at the same school where I had taught. So moving down to the main office, watching parents come in and out, and watching the attitude of the individuals that work in the office. This is 1999. So the charter school law in Florida went into effect in 98 or 99. So there were maybe a couple of charter schools, not even that. The attitude of the individuals working at that school, if you were to go there today, is so very different because they treat every single parent, every single student like they are a customer, as opposed to, I'm busy on the phone ordering my lunch and I'm chewing gum, paying attention to something else. You can sit there and wait. They don't let parents sit and wait anymore. And so the point is, all of those doomsday predictions, all of those things that they talked about have had the opposite effect. And this is a massive, large urban school district. I'm not talking about a middle-sized or a small or a rural. This is a place where you have 330,000 students. The other thing they said was last year in Florida, when we passed House Bill 1, which created complete universal choice, again, the sky was going to fall, enrollment was going to plummet. How are we going to pay? And, you're going to lose all these teachers. Well, I go back to the same theory. Well, first of all, we're not in the business of employing people. That's not what this is the function of. But number two, they were completely wrong. Guess what happened to the enrollment in Miami-Dade over the last year? An increase of 19,000 students. Now, that did occur because of an influx of people coming into the state, both domestic and people entering the country. Naturally, Miami-Dade is a place where a lot of people go. But they were both complaining about possibly losing enrollment and complaining that they were going to have too many kids that were English speakers of, the English was their second language. So I had a meeting with them and I said, you guys got to figure this out. I mean, which one is it going to be? Do you want more enrollment or do you not want more? Or are you telling me now that you want to cherry pick what kind of kids you get? And so that's just an example of what does occur, of the reality that has occurred in Florida. And obviously our state is benefiting from a huge boom in net in migration domestically as well as international. But it goes to speak of the fact that everything that they said over the last 20 years was completely wrong. And I go to the title of the program, making it mainstream, because one of my big concerns as a legislator was always, we got to get these programs to build a constituency to the point where if we ever lose elections, they can't rip them away because the constituency is so big, the demand is so big that there's no political way for you to rip this out and then remove these from these kids. That's definitely already happened with charters in Florida. They've become mainstream, and we'll talk about that. So this didn't happen overnight, right? It was 25 years. And I tried to go back prior to my time and really give credit where credit is due. And that's, the Jeb Bush administration, when he came in, both the accountability piece, which folks in the school choice movement, sometimes they don't want to talk about the accountability piece. But here's what I'll tell you. Without the accountability piece, school choice doesn't work, because what happens is, how do you start to transparently highlight the things that are wrong that get parents to understand that there are better choices? And so that piece started around that time. In 1999, the Opportunity Scholarship was signed into law, and it said that students that were attending a failing school, according to the accountability system, were able to receive a scholarship. And there was also the establishment of the McKay Scholarship, which is the first scholarship in Florida for students with disabilities. That was thrown out by the Florida Supreme Court at that time. And so in 2001, the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship was born, providing tax credits, and those donations could be used then to fund scholarships. And that's really where the first group of students in Florida, when it comes to scholarships, vouchers, whatever it is that you want to call them. And I know that John Kirtley is here somewhere, and he's going to be on the panel next. And John has done tremendous work, and he's actually been there through the whole time of this story. So, I only jumped in the middle of it. Like I said, when I got elected to the legislature, I began working on some of these things, and there had been a little bit of a lag, right? There had been a little bit of that stagnation. But a couple of years later, we created something called the Personal Learning Scholarship Account. Long, convoluted name. Actually, that became what is now known as our Family Empowerment Scholarship for Unique Abilities. It was called the Gardner Scholarship for a while. At one point, we actually merged the Gardner Scholarship and the McKay. So the McKay Scholarship had been just the traditional scholarship for students with disabilities to be able to go to a private school based on the matrix of services that they receive. And so there's a dollar amount attached directly to the student based on the matrix of services. It's not a cookie cutter program. This became popular, but when we passed what we then called the PLSA, that later became the Gardner Scholarship, named after the Senate president that was there at the time, people really didn't know or didn't understand ESAs in Florida, because remember that what existed before was just a scholarship. You went, paid for tuition, you received those services at a school. The minute that you opened the ESA, people started to discover that even with a child with disabilities, now they could really customize and cater the education of their children and the services that they were providing, to one point where somebody brought, and I had, this was not something that I was aware of. Somebody was talking about, paying for equine therapy. And I'm thinking, oh, there we go. There come the articles. There's a kid with a horse, and now the parents are throwing the money out the door, and this, only to find out after speaking to the experts that this is a very effective treatment or therapy for a student in certain situations. And so from there, we developed to the point where we are today, which is our massive Florida Family Empowerment Scholarship for Unique Abilities, which has so much demand that it causes the legislature to have to go back and fund it at a higher amount every year, and is really, really a success story. And those parents are able to do things like equine therapy, and then you get articles, right? Because the media does such a great job of reporting these things. That, we get an article like a few weeks ago that says, well, parents in Florida bought a 52-inch TV for a kid on a scholarship, and then they don't even call it an ESA. And our answer is yes. The student has vision problems, and the television is necessary for them to be able to read the large letters. So it's part of their education. But they never print that answer. So it's constantly under attack still by the media, despite all of the background that I gave you, despite the fact that the sky didn't fall. They don't like it because it's not part of the status quo institution. In 2019, when Governor DeSantis took office as governor of Florida, is the same time that I went over to the Florida Senate. And he came in with a very bold agenda on education. But a lot of people, because of all the noise that's happened since, don't realize that his first order of business was that tax credit scholarship that I had talked about that had been around since 2001 had a constant waiting list because it had a cap on the amount of money that you could bring in. And he said, we need to do something to eliminate this wait list. And I got together with him and also the Speaker of the Florida House at that time, a dear friend, Jose Oliva, and said, we're going to just go ahead and create a scholarship that's going to come direct from state funds. And many of the naysayers told us, again, you're just going to get thrown out in court, right? The Florida Supreme Court is going to throw it out. The problem is, or fortunately for us, Florida has an age out clause of our Supreme Court justices. And so 3 of those justices happened to age out at the same time that Governor DeSantis entered the governorship. And he was able on day 1 to appoint 3 new justices to the Florida Supreme Court. We were able to pass that bill and create the Family Empowerment Scholarship with the first year cap of 18,000 students. And the reason we did that is because all of us thought we need to, first of all, take care of the waiting list. But second of all, we need to establish the market. We can't just open this up in Florida without knowing how many private school seats there actually are. Remember, the first Family Empowerment Scholarship was a scholarship, not an educational savings account. And so we did that with the idea that we'd be able to come back and expand it. And sure enough, the next year we came back and expanded that. And that at the time when we expanded that in 2020, that became the largest, most expansive school choice bill in the country at the moment. But going into, what was it, 2022, John, that we started hearing all these news stories coming out of Arizona saying that Arizona is going to surpass Florida in school choice. I said, wait a minute, hold on a second. We've been doing this for 20 years. You're going to show up now and all of a sudden you're the leaders in school choice. And so thanks to the leadership again of Governor DeSantis and really our current speaker, Paul Renner, House Bill 1 was passed, creating the most expansive school choice program in the country. And that ended all the noise. If nobody's ever asked me about Arizona again, I don't know why. But they've done a good job over there. But again, that was again an example of the will to get these things done and the push to be able to get through this despite the noise and the narrative and the fact that you're constantly going to be battling the status quo, the media, and whoever else doesn't like what you're doing, because you are eventually going to cut into money that they think belongs to them. Those are the scholarship programs, and I'll tell you what the numbers are today, and John might correct me, but the last I got from the office was we're currently over 430,000 applications received, 420,000 students awarded a scholarship, and that's an increase of over last year's enrollment of 250,000 students. So that is a giant leap. I know that program alone is larger than than some states have students, right? So it is a credit to the folks that do that work, and John is one of them, by the way. So that leaves us when it comes to school choice programs of scholarships. We have the Family Empowerment Scholarship, which we call the EO for educational options, the Family Empowerment Scholarship for students with unique abilities, which we talked about, the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship, which is now also an ESA, and the Hope Scholarship and the New World Reading Scholarship Account. the New World Reading Scholarship account is an interesting thing that happens. So, and I don't know if you remember this, John, but it was the middle of the legislature, and I'm trying to come up with ideas, right? I'm thinking, what do we do for kids that, this is before we passed the Family Empowerment Scholarship. So what do we do for kids that are at public school, right? And the parents are low income and they're stuck and they can't get extra help for these kids. And we don't want the same school that's failing them during the day to be able to give, to do the same thing. And so we came up with the idea of a reading scholarship. And I originally think I started as an idea over the summer, like a summer scholarship for them to participate in a reading camp. And ended up that it's now called the New World Reading Scholarship because the speaker that just left office over the last 2 years created a whole literacy initiative around, and it's called the New World Reading Initiative. And so they tagged on to these scholarships. And so it is not a huge amount of money, but think of a low-income family, right? That doesn't have any resources to provide something extra for their kids and decides, look, I don't want to take the kid to private school. They're going to stay at a public school, but I can now provide them help after school from somebody other than the folks in the same building. And so even though that's a small piece, I do like to highlight it because I think it's important that we continue to do that work around literacy and we provide those opportunities. So other than the popular buzz of the day scholarships, our charter school ecosystem in Florida is extremely healthy and, like I said, has become mainstream. We have over 300,000 students in charter schools and over 700 charter schools in Florida. We started off small. It started to grow in specific populated areas, and we're finally expanding across the state. A lot of times we're in Florida, our school districts are divided by county. So we have 67 counties, 67 school districts. So as you can imagine, if you want to expand, going from district to district and having to apply became something that we started to hear from charter operators as a roadblock. And so we were able to, over the last few years, pass several pieces of legislation, creating not only a statewide authorizing commission, but also allowing our state colleges, 28 state colleges, to be able to sponsor charter schools in their area of service. And we are proud to report that we already have our first one. It's in Tallahassee, Florida, and it is a charter school that's geared towards career and technical education, designed to have the students leave there ready for a career path. And so what this does is it creates an equalizer for those districts that are not friendly to approving charters and for those operators that want to come in. We also had a piece of legislation in 2017 that created Schools of Hope. Schools of Hope was a vision for a separate species of charter that would be given an easier glide path to come into the state. If you were an operator outside the state that had a track record of serving low-income minority communities with a success rate, we would give you a glide path, and there was actually funding attached to it to help bring them into the state, including not having to have your teachers have traditional certification. And so we've brought in several operators into the state, going into our urban areas. Both KIP from New Jersey is in the state, IDEA Schools from Texas, and we're working on a couple of others. We also have Matter Academy, which is a Florida-based operator who specializes going into specifically majority Hispanic areas and has a tremendous track record and success rate. And we actually just had to implement our turnaround statute. And in Pensacola, we had a school that had been failing for a long time, and our state board voted to go ahead and implement the option, and the district chose Charter Schools USA. So they've taken over Warrington Middle School, which is very important to us because Warrington Middle School is located across, right down the street from an important naval air station. And what happens is the Navy is very vested in it, because what happens is your BRAC score includes schooling for those folks that are transferred there. And so they were very interested in making sure that we have improvement there. The business community has rallied around that. And so that's becoming mainstream, having the ability to use charters to solve these kinds of issues and really get into. And then we've seen in Florida, I think we have 13 classical charter schools that have opened. So we've seen the classical charter school movement really start to grow in Florida. And again, that's another option for parents. It's very different. And again, that's an option where I think parents really have to understand what they're getting themselves into, right? Because going to a classical school is not the same thing as just showing up at a traditional school. And we've been able to do this and again, make this mainstream, where I think now, regardless of where it happened with an election, in Florida, charter schools are safe and they are something that parents demand in neighborhoods. I'm going to go ahead and in conclusion and just again, I want to thank in our state, we're very fortunate, to have Governor DeSantis and his vision on education, but really all of those that have served in the legislature and that have had contributions to this, and again, had the will and the desire to see these things through, because oftentimes that is what those are the questions we get from legislative delegations or other state chiefs that come and visit with us and find out, how do you get these policies? It is a relentless chase of continuing to push. And if you look at some of the timelines that I gave you, we created the scholarship in 1 year, and the very next year, when people were telling us, but wait, you just created the scholarship. Yeah, we want to expand it. And then the year after that, go back at it again. The same thing with our charter school statutes, back at it and back at it, continuing to improve upon those choices, because it is the very best defense is to be constantly on offense. And so again, I want to thank you for having me here. I want to thank you guys for listening to some of the Florida story, and hopefully I was able to be as concise as possible, because we can, sometimes run away with so many achievements that we want to brag about. But thank you for the opportunity. And again, that is the way, going back to the initial quote, that is the way that we can allow parents to realize the quote from Dr. Martin Luther King is to provide that opportunity for every student by breaking the mold and making all of these options mainstream. Thank you very much.
So, Commissioner, I know there's a lot of questions out there. Do you have a minute or two?
Of course.
Yeah. So let me ask the first one. One day I was reading the test scores, and I noticed that for the Hispanic students in Florida, they were doing better than all the students in California. They took the average student in California, they were not scoring as well as the Hispanic students in Florida. And I said, what in the world? This is not the way I'm told things are supposed to be. So was I misreading things, or is there some truth to that?
No, that's a good question. There's definitely truth to that. And I think what happens is, look, some of this, and I'm not going to pretend there's not a huge difference between California Hispanics and Florida Hispanics. There's some cultural differences there, especially when it comes to education. But I think part of it is the importance placed on education within Florida Hispanic families. And the other part is this quilt of options where parents, especially Hispanic parents, take advantage of these choice programs. If you go to Miami-Dade County and you look at who is going into these programs, both the charter programs, the scholarship programs, the magnet and academy programs that the districts offer, these Hispanic parents are always looking for a better place to put their child. And they will do it if they have 4 kids. They will figure out which spot is best suited for each individual kid, and not just leave all 4 at one school. So I think that is a product of that kind of culture and also the ability in Florida to be able to direct that into a place where it's effective for the individual child.
All right, thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Thank you very much. So I do some work in some advocacy work for ESAs in Virginia. And I had a question. You were talking about some of the lower income families being able to have that opportunity to take advantage of that choice. It's one thing to provide the money, but what mechanism do you have to help those families find those resources and to be able to utilize them? I have a background in education. I work with a lot of low income families who the resources may have been available, but they didn't know how to access them. So tell me about some of the mechanisms you have for that.
Are you, just to clarify, are you talking about the New World Reading Scholarship or just the ESAs in general?
Well, really ESAs in general. I mean, the money's there, but do they know where to look to be able to get that, maybe the additional help or the support they need for their child?
Well, the interesting part is the person I'm going to brag about is in the room. So it's really the partnership with our scholarship funding organization that the scholarship funding organization does more than just process applications and make sure that a student is eligible. They are the ones working with the participating private schools. They are the ones working with the participating providers when it comes to unique abilities. They are the ones that are working with the families and making them aware of the opportunities that are available. And that contact and that work within the community is incredibly important, because you're absolutely right. If you could have all of these programs in place, if you don't have, number one, awareness, and number two, resources for them to find it, then it doesn't work. But we're fortunate that, Step Up for Students in Florida has been there for over 20 years and doing this work. And as a matter of fact, doing educational savings account for over 10 years, because we started that PLSA that later became the Gardner 10 years ago. And so I think it's more difficult to manage the ESA with unique abilities because of all the different things that you have to approve and reimburse than just a regular ESA where a student is probably going to mostly use it for tuition. But their work is twofold. It's not only ministerial and managerial, but also outreach, providing information, and making sure that parents and communities are aware of all of that.
What was the name of that organization again?
In Florida, we have Step Up for Students, and we have AAA, which I can't remember what AAA stands for at the moment.
Okay. Yep.
Commissioner Don Swyfer, National Microschooling Center, congratulations on, and thank you for your leadership through the remarkable narrative that you laid out. Microschooling is really something that is compelling across Florida, and so many amazing educators are leaving traditional settings to launch their own microschools. A challenge that is being faced is somewhat arbitrary regulation, not necessarily from your agency, from other agencies that have locally appointed regulators who we understand what's in the statute, but they might not as well. And it's actually delayed microschools from opening in some cases, and it's problematic for microschools across Florida. And if there were some sort of mechanism to maybe align or just plain educate as some of the new statutes come through, like the bathroom statute, it would be incredibly helpful for great educators launching microschools across the state. Is there any mechanism that you could think?
Well, that's an interesting story, because I'll tell you what the parallels are. Well, number one, the good thing is I can tell you I'm not a legislator anymore, so I can't pass a new law to fix it, but I'm sure we can get it to our legislature. But this phenomenon of local, this is when we're talking about, again, when you're fighting the establishment, the status quo, it's not just school boards, it's county commissions. It's locally elected officials that take it upon themselves to think that they're going to decide. So in Florida, even though the statutes are very clear, we just went through this with charter schools. So what they would do is charter school, first the school boards were trying to knock down the applications. Well, we have an appeal process. 100% of the time, almost, they were getting overturned on appeal because they didn't have any statutory standing to reject them. When that didn't work, they figured out how to go over to the county commission or the zoning board or whatever it was to block the schools from being able to open because of this or that. ignoring our statutes and the educational code where it says that all schools have to be treated equal, which means what you do at a public school, you should be able to do regardless of what, well, that doesn't necessarily work because the public schools in Dade County police themselves when it comes to permits and building and construction and all those things. So I think what you're seeing here is the same parallel, is either a lack of understanding, sometimes I give them the benefit of the doubt, or just a movement to start to block this before this becomes the next hot thing that starts to both drain students and drain teachers that, as you said, have an opportunity now to become, they're an entrepreneur and their own boss and start something that works for kids. So I think where the issue, where it has to be tweaked and where the legislature really has to look at that is what is going on with local powers or what are they misinterpreting? Unfortunately, sometimes folks have come to me from the charter world when we're going through us, and I said, look, I know you guys are like lawsuit averse because you don't want to make enemies locally, but sometimes we just can't write the law to say we really, really mean it. Sometimes you're just going to have to sue because it's already written there. So I think that there are some tweaks for micro schools. I think a lot of them have to do with that local resistance. And I think, again, it's a movement that'll go through growing pains just like the charter movement went through. But I think that we can get there quicker because there's more awareness now of some of these issues.
Okay, so right over here.
Betsy Bartholet, Harvard Law School. I hear you in terms of the success that parents are choosing these options alternative to the public school, but I'd like to know more whether there's evidence that it's successful for the kids. So evidence in terms of reading scores that Paul Peterson mentioned, or some other evidence that it's really working better for kids than the public schools were.
I wish I would have brought my evidence with me, but this is an incredible point across several metrics. Number one, philosophically, some of you in the room may agree with me, some of you may not, but philosophically, I don't measure the success of choice that way. I measure the success of the ultimate arbiter of success of choice is the parent of that child. If they are happy that that student is successful at that setting, that's ultimately what matters to me. However, we do have test scores. There are requirements that they have to take. There's a list of national norm reference tests. Florida State University does receive that every year and keeps track of it. We also have studies that have been done by the Urban Institute that measures the success of our public schools that are in conjunction with these private schools. In other words, the more choice there is in these areas, the better the performance of the public schools that are there. Again, another metric that is not normally conventional, but what happens when you provide competition and you have to raise the bar. So our track record of increasing performance in Florida over the last 20 years, some of it attributed obviously to our accountability system, but is without fail, there is increased productivity from our students. There's increased literacy, there's increased math. However, all of that falls into different buckets, and I wouldn't judge the success of a school choice program the same way that you would judge you're able to measure something in just the regular public schools because they have that standard. But they do, to be clear, they do take a nationally norm reference test as a requirement, and those results are recorded and kept at Florida State University by a center that is there.
All right, one more question and then we're going to go to our panels. So, okay, in the back there. Second row.
Are you concerned with college readiness for kids in Florida, especially with the reduction in books in classrooms as well as access to AP exams and classes?
Not at all. As a matter of fact, I just want to clarify something. We have zero reduction of AP access in our schools, and it's actually, we've had an expansion. So whatever narrative you're reading nationally, the AP classes, including the psychology one, is taught across our state by every district that wants to teach it without any restrictions. We've had additional ACE and IB programs, and we just passed another expansive dual enrollment program that will have an end of course exam to raise the bar. And those students that pass that have, by statute, the ability to transfer those courses directly into any state school in Florida. And if they pass the course and the exam, they get the credit for that general course. So we are extremely excited about all of the options that our students have. And the only books that are removed in Florida by a local process are books that have obscenity and pornographic materials. And so the last thing I heard from the head of the teachers union is that Florida had banned To Kill a Mockingbird, only to find that if you go into Florida's best standards, one of the books that's recommended reading for our high school students is To Kill a Mockingbird. So I would just be careful with political narratives that exist without digging into facts.
All right, well, thank you very much. Our next